Your current salary is already high for this position. We can increase it this year, maybe next year if our financials improve. That's how Jared ended our first one-on-one meeting. After 2 months of silence. I'm Marla, Senior Transition Manager. I joined this company when there were 5 of us and no formal processes. Just half-built templates, client notes scribbled on sticky pads, and deals held together with goodwill. 15 years later, we had nearly 100 employees, 12 enterprise clients, and a system that only stayed upright because I reinforced it in places no one noticed. I was the person they called when timelines slipped, departments clashed, or accounts were about to walk. I didn't run a team. I ran friction, quietly, effectively. Jared didn't ask about any of that. He was brought in 6 months ago, an external hire with a cost-cutting mandate and a clean reputation from a recently acquired startup. He was polite, articulate, and fully aligned with strategic compensation frameworks. When I submitted a raise request, my first in 5 years, I kept it short. 3 paragraphs, performance data, retention stats, impact metrics, no response. Week 2, finance is finalizing models. Week 4, still waiting on leadership alignment. Week 7, let's meet next week. Week 9, a 15-minute Zoom link, no agenda. His explanation lasted 90 seconds. No mention of impact, no acknowledgement of history, just top of band and not financially justifiable, like reading a forecast about someone who wasn't in the room. I didn't react, not there. But the message was clear. They didn't plan to push me out. They just didn't plan to keep me invested, so I made 3 changes. First, the calendar. I canceled the recurring syncs where I usually caught issues before they became fire drills. Second, the accounts. I shifted ownership, 3 to Rachel, 2 to Dev, 1 to Nathan. All visible, all logged. Third, the assumptions. I removed myself from the invisible roles no one tracked. Pre-approvals, vendor patches, side channel alerts. I didn't withdraw in protest. I adjusted the weight, silently, precisely. No one asked. On paper, it looked like delegation. In practice, I tilted the structure, just enough for it to notice. Rachel was sharp, but she panicked under pressure. Dev moved fast, but skipped details. Nathan played it safe, until the safe thing collapsed. None of them were set up to fail, but none of them had what I never documented. That night, I shut my laptop at 5:01. No Slack, no inbox, no reaction. They hadn't fired me, but they decided I was optional. So I began stepping out, quietly. Let's see what happens when the part no one sees stops holding everything in place. On the surface, everything looked fine. The reassignments I made had been accepted without question. Rachel picked up the renewals, Dev took the new onboarding projects, Nathan handled the backlog. Folders were shared, access granted, templates updated, no flags raised, but what I'd handed over was structure, not substance. Within days, the cracks began to show. Rachel executed flawlessly, by the book. She followed the checklist, scheduled the cadence calls, flagged contract anomalies, but when a client she'd inherited asked about an unofficial exception we'd been honoring since 2019, she hesitated. Then, trying to sound decisive, she committed to an answer she couldn't authorize. Legal got involved. The client paused the renewal. It was one of our oldest accounts. Dev, true to form, dove into the onboarding sprint like a hero in motion. He liked speed, visibility, momentum. What he missed was nuance. The moment he skipped the second integration review, thinking it redundant, the client's technical team pushed back, citing a breach of alignment protocol. The result, a minor escalation that wouldn't have happened under my watch. But this one came with CCs, legal, finance, compliance, and the client's VP. Now it was on record. Nathan was quieter. He took his assignments, followed instructions, and asked no questions. But silence can be dangerous. 2 clients he handled went unresponsive after receiving onboarding summaries that were correct, but tone-deaf. I'd built rapport with those accounts over years. He didn't know the backstory, and no one told him. They didn't answer his follow-ups. They pushed their timelines out. One asked to be reassigned. No one blamed me. No one mentioned my name. But inside the system, I could feel the rhythm shift. Clients who used to reply in 20 minutes now took days. Internal teams started asking each other questions I used to anticipate. The sense of control that once held things steady began to loosen. 2 weeks later, Jared sent a company-wide email. We're seeing strong signs of growth as new leaders step up and take ownership. He named Rachel, applauded Dev's initiative, credited Nathan for consistency. He wasn't lying. He was preloading the narrative. You don't cut legacy talent without a replacement story. He needed them to look ready, even if they weren't. I didn't push back, but I began observing more closely. I started mapping weak points, not to expose them, but to understand where stress would land next. I knew which clients wouldn't tolerate redundancy, which ones flagged delays as signs of deeper instability. I made a list, not public, not on any system, of risk points that wouldn't show up in metrics. Yet. And I waited, because I knew Jared wasn't done. The handovers were only phase 1. He needed a flagship success to complete the story. Look, the machine works without her. And that's when I saw it. Dev was being positioned to lead a new high-profile account, a 6-miller onboarding with compressed deadlines, regulatory dependencies, and a client notorious for withdrawing at the first sign of internal chaos. It was a suicide assignment for someone who didn't know what friction sounded like until it was already public. Jared knew that, but he also knew that if Dev pulled it off, on paper, it would close the loop, justify the structure, justify the silence, justify me. Only that signature hadn't happened yet, and I still had the original risk memo buried in the version history. The onboarding contract was dated last Thursday. Signed by Dev, co-signed by Jared, legal reviewed it, apparently. And yet, what I was holding wasn't just a PDF, it was proof of a signature that should have triggered an automatic compliance hold. That clause wasn't buried, it was bolded. In Q2 of last year, I'd flagged a conflict between the client's industry classification and one of our bundled integrations. It wasn't a hard block, but it required legal clearance before any binding commitments. I wrote a memo, logged the risk, updated the onboarding protocol. Anyone accessing the original template would have seen the note, unless they didn't use the original, unless someone copied and renamed a version and bypassed the alert. I ran a diff check. The metadata didn't lie. This contract had been cloned, renamed, and re-uploaded under a new folder, outside the legal-controlled repository. No one had deleted my warning. They just worked around it. I didn't raise it immediately. Instead, I scheduled a coffee with Inez from legal. We weren't friends, but we'd traded favors before. I once caught a licensing mismatch she missed during maternity leave. She hadn't forgotten. Over coffee, I mentioned the client name. Casually, she paused. Didn't know they finalized. Thought that one was still under review. I let that sentence hang. Inez went quiet, then she pulled out her phone. 10 minutes later, I received a Slack message, not from her, but from someone on her team. Hey Marla, quick question. Do you remember flagging a classification issue for Regulus Group last year? I didn't reply immediately, because what I needed wasn't to prove I was right. What I needed was for legal to discover the gap themselves, to follow the version trail, to realize that the onboarding had been signed without clearance, and that Dev had used a scrubbed version, a version Jared had approved. By that afternoon, legal had pulled the file. By evening, Inez had gone quiet. The next morning, I watched as Jared forwarded a Slack message to Dev, then opened a private call, then canceled the client kickoff. No explanation. Internally, nothing was said. No announcement, no retraction, but the account disappeared from the onboarding pipeline, and I knew that silence well. It was the kind that comes right before a search for who's accountable. I didn't insert myself. I didn't ask questions. I just opened the updated pipeline list and started circling the next name they'd try to push forward. I didn't have to touch a thing. By Friday morning, legal had started a private Slack thread about the Regulus onboarding. I wasn't on it, but I knew it was there, because Inez didn't look me in the eye when we crossed paths in the break room. That was her tell. She only avoided you when something had gone wrong that might eventually land at your desk. I poured coffee and left her in silence. Legal silence is different. It doesn't scream. It traces, it follows metadata, email timestamps, signature trails. And because Jared's name sat directly on the contract, they couldn't escalate upward, not without implicating someone they weren't ready to challenge. So they moved sideways. Ops got questions first, soft ones, then compliance. Then, late in the afternoon, I got a ping from someone on Inez's team. Hey Marla, just double-checking something. Did Regulus ever fall under restricted classification? I'm seeing a memo you might have authored. I didn't answer right away, not because I was hiding, because I knew what legal feared more than misconduct. Unlogged knowledge. Things known but not documented. Things forgotten but discoverable. Silence creates pressure in places no policy covers. I walked out early that day, not in defiance, just as punctuation. By Monday morning, compliance had joined the thread, and that changed everything. Compliance doesn't investigate people, they investigate patterns. And once they found that Regulus had been manually downgraded from sensitive tier to standard commercial by Jared, just weeks before it was fast-tracked, they began comparing it with other reclassifications. I watched from the outside, never reacting, never commenting. Because I didn't need to speak. The system was already mutating from within. Regulus had triggered the thread, but now 5 more client names appeared in compliance logs, all of them recent, all manually approved. 2 had previously been flagged as subject to industry-specific clauses. Those clauses weren't small. They impacted liability ceilings, and none of them had passed through full legal routing. Inez's name was nowhere on those files, which meant Jared had used LP's shortcuts, again. Possibly coached Dev and Rachel to do the same. Efficiency, he would have said. Client-first mentality. But now legal couldn't contain it quietly. Too many hands had touched it. Too many blind approvals already lived in systems they couldn't retroactively explain. I opened my personal archive. 2 years ago, I'd started tracking patterns. Not to punish, but to survive. I'd labeled the folder, exceptions that became practice. Inside, 17 client records. 9 with legal bypasses, 4 with undocumented clause edits, 3 involving staff no longer employed, and 1 name stood out, Xenotech. Xenotech wasn't a problem yet because it hadn't been mentioned. But I knew Jared had quietly reactivated them 4 weeks ago. I'd seen the vendor integration notes buried under a re-onboard draft tag. Same product scope, same legal loophole I'd once flagged and shelved under CEO decision, risk accepted. The only reason it hadn't blown up, no one had looked at it yet. Xenotech didn't need a whistleblower. It just needed to land on the wrong desk at the right time. So this time, I didn't wait. I sent a casual message. Not to legal, not to ops, not even to compliance. I sent it to Nina, junior finance analyst, detail-oriented, former auditor, the kind of person who couldn't let a naming mismatch go unchecked. All I asked was simple. Hey, saw the Xenotech tag in the integration doc. Do you know who's reconciling that contract line with the older compliance notes? Just making sure it's the same scope as before. No accusation, no threat, no attachment. I didn't need to push, just tilt. It began with a message from finance, not to me, to the shared channel Jared rarely used. Flag discrepancy in renewal class tags versus contract line items. Possible legacy override not synced with current compliance banding. It was dry, technical, but I saw the name at the bottom. Nina Tran, the same junior analyst I'd messaged 2 days ago. Jared replied within 10 minutes, a rare speed for him. He thanked her, said he'd follow up offline. Then he archived the thread. But in this company, nothing disappears, especially not when finance uses the word override. By noon, a second thread had started, this time between legal, finance, and the internal risk office. And I wasn't in it. That was intentional. That was the beginning of the reorg. It didn't come with a chart or a memo, no org-wide announcement, just calendar changes, meeting removals, and the quiet reassignment of several client accounts. My access to the onboarding system was downgraded. I wasn't removed, just read-only. The same day, my name disappeared from 3 of the Slack channels I'd built, channels where decisions got made before they had names. I walked past the break room and saw Dev sitting with Rachel, looking at a whiteboard full of timelines. They didn't invite me over, but Rachel caught my eye, not out of malice, out of confusion, because even she didn't know I was being removed. That's what made it surgical. Jared didn't fire me, he didn't demote me, he repositioned me out of proximity, out of decision loops, a ghost in my own structure. At 4:12 p.m., my calendar pinged with a new recurring invite. Transition oversight sync, archive only weekly, read only, optional. It was a message, masked as logistics. They were taking my structure, the one I designed, the one I never claimed credit for, the one that didn't break, until now. But systems don't collapse because of permission levels. They collapse because of what's still embedded in their logic. That evening, while pulling old notes, I found something I'd forgotten, buried in an onboarding recap sent to me by an intern named Louise over a year ago. Louise had since rotated to procurement. Quiet girl, always took notes even when no one asked. Her email said, FYI, client asked if the automatic fallback clause still exists for external vendor lockouts. I couldn't find it in the doc, but Dev told them yes. Just flagging in case it needs review. Back then, I'd patched it, quietly, internally. No client ever saw the gap, but now, that clause was still broken, and Xenotech used that fallback clause, and now Jared had reactivated Xenotech without rechecking the patch. Louise had forgotten about it, but I hadn't. The system was no longer mine. But the flaw still was. I didn't build a perfect system. I built one that knew when to fail, quietly, reversibly, in a way that forced people to slow down and ask why. When legal delayed approvals, I installed conditional timeouts. When sales skipped compliance flags, I wrote soft blocking logic that rerouted risky contracts to internal holding. When operations overloaded a pipeline, the workflow split itself, dividing urgent from fragile. I never called it a legacy system. To me, it was a survival map. It worked because people respected its logic until they didn't. Xenotech. Phase 1 went live on a Tuesday morning. There was no announcement, no Slack buzz, no update in onboarding channels. But I knew it launched because my inbox, my private inbox, not company, received a digest from a bot I had built during the 2020 vendor audit. It was buried in our deprecated process environment. Still running, still logging, still reporting to 3 addresses: legal, compliance, and mine. The subject line was simple: duplicate vendor record flagged, Xenotech 6th recon. The duplication wasn't the problem, it was what it meant. When Dev pushed the override to accelerate Xenotech's integration, he triggered a fallback clause that conflicted with their compliance classification. The system didn't block him, it rerouted, just like I designed it to do. It quietly copied the record into a recon queue. It created a holding version of the contract for internal audit, and it flagged the clause Jared had personally deactivated 3 weeks earlier, without legal sign-off. I didn't forward the message. I didn't reply, because I already knew what would happen next. At 10:16 a.m., Inez replied to the digest. At 11:42 a.m., her manager replied, CCing the CIO. By 2:00 p.m., Risk had created a system-wide freeze on all vendor contracts approved outside of legal routing. The freeze wasn't public, but Dev knew. His project dashboard lit up with red. Rachel knew too. She'd been relying on Xenotech to fulfill a backlog deliverable for a renewal client now days from expiration. She pinged me once, then twice. No message, just the notification. I didn't respond because the message wasn't mine to answer anymore. They had taken the system. Now they were holding its pieces, confused why it didn't move forward. At 4:11 p.m., I received a calendar invite. System architecture review, urgent, required, Jared legal, risk, CIO optional, Marla. That word again, optional. I clicked accept, not out of duty, out of clarity. Because if they were going to pull apart the structure I left behind, they needed to understand what held it together and why it was beginning to reject them. The meeting started late. Jared looked composed, overcomposed. The CIO was scanning notes. Dev looked like he was trying not to blink. Inez kept her hands clasped on the desk. The chief risk officer joined last and spoke first. We've identified multiple onboarding workflows that contain undocumented fallback logic. Some of those failovers are triggering duplicate compliance records. Others are activating archived approval trees. We need to understand who built these systems and why these functions weren't sunset. That's when the CIO turned to me, and for the first time since this began, someone asked the right question. Marla, can you walk us through what we're looking at? I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just opened a file on my screen. It was dated 4 years ago. Title, Load Redistribution Logic, Vendor Fallback, Tier 2-3 Risk. I didn't need to say much. The structure spoke for itself, because what they were standing in wasn't just broken, it was reacting exactly as it was designed to. The system hadn't crashed, it just stopped working the way they expected it to. Vendor approvals didn't go through. Renewals were missing contract tags. Workflows looped without resolution because no one knew which trigger released which logic. And then mid-core walked. They didn't shout, didn't threaten. They simply replied, "We've decided not to renew." That one client, 8 years of history, was enough to shake the table. Jared tried to bury it in context. Dev said the new onboarding model had glitches. Rachel offered to call them personally, but nothing reversed the flag that now sat in the CEO's inbox. The subject line, client departure, escalated. And then, at 9:17 a.m., the CEO replied to the thread with 4 words. Why am I seeing this? He had sent it to Jared, Risk, Legal, Ops, not me. But at 10:03 a.m., inside the hashtag Risk Review channel, a message popped up. Marla, loop her in, we need her in the room. I didn't comment, I didn't heart the message. I just accepted the unspoken invitation, because when they ask for the person they tried to erase, you don't walk in angry, you walk in aware. By noon, the diagram started circulating again. System schematics I'd built 3 years ago. No one had touched them since. Now, everyone had questions. The CIO admitted several fallback logs were still routed through admin panels no one had access to. Legal asked about approval flows that didn't match compliance templates. And Risk couldn't explain why 2 vendors had double entries with mismatched terms. At 2:30 p.m., I entered the room they said I wouldn't need to return to. The glass walls, the too bright projector, the silence when I stepped in, it all felt familiar. Except now, they weren't ignoring me. They were waiting. Jared didn't speak. He just slid his chair an inch to the left and let the CIO run the meeting. The questions came faster than I could answer. I didn't try to. I just listened. I had already written the answers. They were in the systems, in the logic, in the fail-safes they thought were invisible. At 4:03 p.m., the meeting ended. No decisions, just a scramble to assign blame without calling it that. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a message from the CEO. You free for 5? I met him in the executive hallway. Just him, no assistant, no audience. He didn't explain, he didn't apologize. He just asked, how long would it take to fix what they broke? I looked at him, not with defiance, but with clarity. Depends. Are you asking me to rebuild it or to cover their shortcuts? He didn't answer, not directly, but he did something he hadn't done in 2 years. He waited for my next sentence, so I gave it to him. What broke wasn't structure or code. It was the cost of pretending memory didn't matter. And for the first time, he didn't look away. I didn't walk back to my desk after the CEO's question. I walked out of the building instead. No drama, no announcement, just one step past the turnstile and through the side exit, where no one watches who comes and goes. The next morning, I wasn't there. At 9:06 a.m., Rachel sent me a Slack. Hey, quick check-in. Are you joining the stabilization review later? I didn't respond. By 10:40, the legal team pulled up one of my old continuity maps from the vendor migration project 3 years ago. It had never been published formally, but everyone used it, quietly. The file name still had my initials. The title, Renewal Routing Logic, Multi-Tier Escalation Conditions, Draft 3, it was a document written in shorthand. For insiders. Now it was being circulated like doctrine, but they didn't know how to read it. By noon, Dev asked a question in the department-wide channel. Does anyone know what Tier 2 suppression fork means in Marla's diagram? We're seeing it block the handoff queue. No one replied. 3 people reacted with the eye emoji. That was it. That's what changed. Silence used to be their tool, to exclude me, contain me, control the room without me. Now silence was fear, not of what I'd say, but of what they didn't understand anymore. At 1:14 p.m., Ops pinged it about access to a rule-based dashboard that hadn't been used in over a year. The system bounced back an error. Owner does not exist. Rule disabled. At 2:30, Jared called a meeting titled Leadership Recovery Sync, Redistribution Planning. I didn't attend, but I watched the recording an hour later. They were trying to rebuild from pieces they couldn't name. The CIO looked like he hadn't slept. Rachel was explaining things that used to run themselves. Dev kept flipping tabs. Jared tried to look like a facilitator, but no one was following. The system was still online, but nothing was flowing. At 3:58 p.m., I received an email from someone unexpected. Carly, a client ops lead who had moved to another company last year. We hadn't spoken since her transition, but she still remembered our renewal cycles, how we designed them to feel seamless, not automated. Her message was short. Just heard mid-core dropped. They didn't say why, but they used to swear by your team. Hope you're okay. If you're not there anymore, they're going to feel it. It hit harder than I expected, not because it hurt, but because it reminded me what I used to believe about my work. That when done right, it wasn't flashy. It was invisible. By 4:47 p.m., a new email arrived. From the CEO, no greeting, no summary. Subject, 1 question. Body, if you had to rebuild this from the ground up, what would you refuse to compromise this time? There was no attachment, no CC, just those words, 1 line and a space beneath it that said, waiting for reply. I didn't reply, not yet, but that night, as I closed my laptop, I realized something had shifted. For the first time since they erased me from the system, they weren't asking me to return. They were asking what I needed to say yes. I didn't reply to the CEO's message that night. I waited until the next morning. Then I sent one line, "Let's talk with terms." By noon, we were in a room together, just the two of us. No Jared, no legal, no ops. The offer was clear. Come back, not as an employee, but as an independent consultant. No reporting lines, no HR process, control over access structures, authority to redesign whatever I deemed necessary, a contract for 4 months, triple my old salary. I read it once. Then I asked only one question. Do I answer to you or the system? He didn't flinch. You answer to results. So I said yes, but I didn't move back into my old seat. I didn't rejoin the Slack channels. I didn't restore my company email. I returned on paper, but not in routine. That week, a third-party audit was initiated, quietly. The CEO had called it after the mid-core fallout. A name I recognized led the team, Tristan Lin, formerly of Granthorpe Systems. Brilliant, clinical, and brutally direct. When we crossed paths in the hallway, he greeted me like an old sparring partner. Didn't expect to see you here, but then again, systems only fail when the wrong people try to own them. He wasn't wrong. Tristan's team didn't just look at code. They pulled access logs, reviewed approval workflows, even traced how Jared's team had bypassed legal reviews during onboarding. The report wasn't pretty, multiple violations of policy, vendor access granted without final review, suppression flags manually overridden, and most damning, documentation showing Jared had asked Dev to accelerate the path on Xynotech without alerting compliance. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. The report spoke for itself. Jared wasn't at the Friday leadership sync. His seat remained empty. No one explained why. Rachel kept her head down. Dev was quieter than usual. The CIO, for once, looked relieved. I spent that Friday rewriting access tiers, not based on title, not based on org chart, based on actual contribution to system stability. 3 roles were downgraded, 2 people lost edit rights to contract templates, and I restored a safety protocol they had ignored for years. Dual flag triggers for all high-value renewal changes. By Monday, the flow had started to recover. Clients were responding again. The mid-core account, though unrecoverable, was no longer a PR threat. And as I walked past the boardroom that afternoon, a junior associate, one who used to avoid eye contact with me, held the door open. "Ms. Reese," he said quietly, "thanks for coming back." I didn't correct him. I wasn't back. I was building something else. By the 3rd week of stabilization, the office had shifted. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. Some roles were quieter, some faces missing, and one name, Jared, faded from the workflow without needing explanation. No official announcement, no visible reassignment, no structural update shared from the top. Yet his calendar was empty. His approvals no longer triggered routing. His key contacts had been redistributed, and the boardroom seat he once used to dominate now remained quietly unclaimed. There was no anger behind it, just a structural correction. That's how real systems move when designed properly. They reject what no longer supports the weight. As the final configurations went live, the air inside the operations floor changed. Rachel's voice became firmer, steadier, less dependent on borrowed authority. Dev began documenting processes he previously improvised. The CIO stopped over-explaining everything and simply executed. They were adjusting, not to me, but to clarity. A clarity they hadn't recognized while noise held the mic. None of this required me to hold power, only to remove the illusions that had kept dysfunction hidden. The audit report was filed. Protocols were locked. Vendor approvals now required dual signatures, staggered routing, and timestamp transparency. No more manual overrides, no more undocumented fast tracks. And for the first time in over a year, no client escalations had hit legal's desk in 7 consecutive business days. That was the signal. One morning, I received a short message from a former colleague. She had worked under me in the early years, quiet, meticulous, often overlooked. Now she was managing client systems for a tech firm in Chicago. She had heard, through channels, conversations, maybe someone on LinkedIn, about what had happened, the failure, the freeze, the return. Her message didn't ask for a job, it didn't seek validation, it simply acknowledged that what I built had outlived my presence. And that, in the world of operational design, was the highest form of legacy. It was enough. Legacy isn't a name on a plaque. It's not the meeting they name after you once you leave. It's the process that continues because it was designed to endure. Not because anyone remembers you, but because forgetting you would break it. On my final day, there was no announcement, just a quiet calendar block marked handoff complete. The last audit log closed. Access revoked at 6:00 p.m. sharp. No Slack thread, no farewell card, no badge turned in with ceremony. The system didn't need a performance. It just needed to keep working. As I left the building, no one stopped me. No one needed to. The same hallway I once walked through after being erased, now open to let me exit fully seen, fully understood without needing to be kept. Power, when real, doesn't demand presence. It builds structure that outlasts ego. And some endings don't require applause, only quiet precision. That was the final hand, and I never had to play it.